She fled her wedding in a snowstorm, still wearing the dress meant to bind her to a lie. No plan, no map, just frostbitten fingers and a heart finally refusing to obey. When she collapsed in the Montana woods, he found her, a quiet widower who didn't ask her name. He just carried her in, stoked the fire, and let her stay. What began as escape became shelter. What began as silence became the life she chose, not the one chosen for her. If you believe real love begins with freedom, stay with us. The veil slipped from Clara Ashford's fingers, forgotten on the polished oak floor. Outside, snow began to fall, not soft and romantic, but sharp, wind-driven, relentless. Inside the great hall of the Ashford estate, light poured through stained glass like fractured jewels, catching the edge of the wedding china, the champagne flutes, the gold filigree invitations that bore her name in calligraphy she hadn't chosen. She stood still in the upstairs hallway, breath shallow, the corset biting deep. Around the corner, behind the half-open door of her father's study, voices twisted through the wood, one of them warm in public, but cold as a coin in private. Once she signs, the trust unlocks, Edwin said, smooth as velvet and twice as false. Give it 3 months and her old man will hand me the reins. That railroad won't run without me. A pause. Laughter. Low, confident, cruel. Clara didn't hear the rest. She didn't need to. Her heart, a careful thing trained to behave, cracked like thin ice under bootsteps. Her fiancé had never loved her. He'd courted her like an investor, and now the return on investment was near. She was not a bride. She was a ledger entry, a key, a pawn on the board of empire-building men. She backed away blindly, fingers scraping against the wallpaper. The dress weighed heavy, layers of silk, pearls and lace that felt more like armor than beauty. Her feet moved without thought, the way one moves through smoke or water, past the guest rooms, down the servant stairwell. No one stopped her. No one saw. The stables were quiet in the falling dark. Her mare, Windbell, nickered softly, as if sensing the tremble in her hands. No saddle, no plan. Just the snow, the ache, and the raw instinct to flee. By the time they reached the timberline, Clara's veil had snagged on a branch and vanished. Her gloves were soaked, her cheeks numb. She urged Windbell forward, past the frozen creek, past scents, past safety. Night dropped fast in the Montana wilderness. The trees closed in. The snow turned violent, blinding. She didn't see the rock until the mare stumbled, reared, and Clara was thrown sideways into the drift. White, all white, cold seeping through the bodice, hands trembling. No sound but the wind and her own breath, ragged, shallow. She tried to rise. Her limbs betrayed her. This, she thought, this is what dying feels like, not pain, not fear, just a kind of quiet resignation. But the dark didn't take her. Not yet. A crunch in the snow. A figure, lantern in hand, silhouetted by stormlight. A voice, low, steady, real. Easy now, I got you. 2 arms lifted her like she weighed nothing, like she mattered. Then, blackness. When Clara woke, it was not to the sound of music or voices or the clink of fine silver. It was to the hiss of wind against cabin walls, and the slow, rhythmic creak of logs settling into warmth. Her vision blurred, breath catching. A low fire burned in a stone hearth across the room. The scent of pine, smoke, and something faintly herbal filled the air, like old earth and dried chamomile. A thick quilt covered her, coarse but warm, stitched by hand. Beneath it, her limbs ached, but her body was dry. The dress was gone. In its place, wool underlayers too big at the wrists, sleeves rolled to fit. Her hair was braided clumsily but carefully, like someone had tried not to tug too hard. Snow tapped against the small window pane. The world outside was still a blur of white and gray, but in here, everything was hushed and slow, as if the room itself knew she'd broken. A wooden chair scraped softly across the floor. She turned her head, flinching. A man stood near the stove, tall and broad-shouldered, with weather-beaten hands and a wool shirt rolled at the cuffs. His beard was short, his movements deliberate. When he met her gaze, he didn't speak, just nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, not possession, not demand. She tried to sit. He moved, gently but firm, placing a steaming mug on the small table beside her. "Tea," he said. One word, voice rough with disuse but kind. She nodded, throat raw, unsure if she could speak even if she tried. He returned to the stove, poured another cup for himself, sat across the room, in a chair near the fire, one boot crossed over the other. He didn't ask who she was, didn't press for a name, a reason, a past. For hours they didn't speak. Only the fire cracked and the kettle hissed, and the wind whispered through the chimney. She dozed and woke again. He brought her broth and bread. Nothing fancy, just hot and filling. When her hands trembled, he looked away, giving her the dignity of silence. That night she lay on the cot by the hearth, watching snow drift outside the glass, her mind thick with memory and frost. In her dreams, voices chased her. Edwin's, her father's, the gossiping mouths of high society. But always the dream broke apart, replaced by the soft knock of a ladle against a tin pot, or the rustle of quilt over pine floorboards. He never entered her space, never hovered. He moved like someone used to loss, quiet in the way only widowers are. Once she asked, her voice barely a whisper, "What's your name?" He looked up from the firewood he was splitting. "Will Calder," he said. "This here's Flat Hollow." Then nothing more. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. Not affection, not yet, but the first slow thaw. The days in Flat Hollow did not move quickly. They didn't rush or expect. They simply were, like the snow, like the wind, like the steady pulse of a land that had long stopped needing permission to be what it was. Clara rose late at first, her limbs sore, her soul quieter than it had been in years. There were no maids here to lace her stays or announce the hour. No walls of silk or oil paintings or perfumed guests. Just the ticking of an old clock and the scent of coffee on the stove, black and bitter, poured into a tin cup. She wore the same wool skirt each morning, boots 2 sizes too large, and Will's extra flannel shirts. The first time she stepped outside the cabin, the air hit her lungs like glass, but she kept going. 1 foot, then another. She fed the hens, carried water, watched Will split wood with a kind of solemn grace, not violent, not angry, just necessary. Sometimes they spoke, mostly they didn't. But it wasn't the silence of society, the sharp, cold kind meant to exclude. It was a soft, working quiet, a respectful hush between people who understood that some wounds aren't ready for words. Will had lost someone too. Clara could see it in the way he touched certain things. The blue shawl folded neatly by the hearth, the way he paused before reaching for the second coffee cup like he hadn't done it in a long time. He didn't say her name, but grief lived here. Not loud, not angry, just present. In time, Clara began to move more freely. She swept the floor, wiped the windows, learned how to keep the fire burning steady through the night. She helped patch a fence one morning, her hands blistered but warm with use. She found a rhythm, and with it, something she didn't recognize at first. Stillness. Not the performative stillness of a lady sitting for a portrait, or waiting for a suitor to arrive. This was something else. A choosing of quiet, of dignity, of waking each day not to serve someone else's expectation, but to simply exist. She caught herself humming once while stirring the stew pot. The sound startled her, not because it was loud, but because it was hers, a piece of her that hadn't been broken or borrowed. That night, Will handed her a dog-eared book, said nothing, just set it beside her on the table before returning to his chair. It was a collection of poetry, worn, water-stained, loved. She read aloud softly by firelight, her voice uncertain at first, then stronger. He didn't comment, just sipped his coffee and closed his eyes, as if hearing something he'd thought he'd lost. There were moments, small ones, that stitched themselves into her like thread. The first time he let her feed the horses alone. The time he brought in extra firewood before a storm without being asked. The way he sometimes looked at her, not with hunger, not with pity, but with a kind of patient curiosity, like he was waiting for her to become herself again. And maybe she was. Not the Clara of ballroom mirrors and polished marble, but Clara Ashford, whoever that might truly be. It began with hoofbeats, distant at first, just a faint echo down the ridge, like thunder pretending to be wind. Clara paused in the yard, bucket in hand, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Will stepped out from the barn beside her, already reaching for his rifle. The snow had just started again, soft and slow, but the air had turned. Heavy, watchful. 3 riders appeared before the hour was out. Men in dark coats, their horses lathered and restless. Hired men. Clara knew the type. The way they scanned the land without reverence, the way they held their reins like whips. She backed away instinctively, but Will stepped forward, placing himself between her and the men. The tallest of them dismounted, his boots crunching hard into the snow. He removed his gloves 1 finger at a time, slow and sure. "Miss Ashford," he said, not a question. Will didn't flinch. "She ain't here." The man's lips curled, not quite a smile. "Come now, we both know that's not true." "I said," Will repeated quieter now, "she's not here." But it didn't matter, not to men like that, not when gold was involved, not when contracts whispered louder than consent. They came at dawn the next morning, broke the door in. Clara screamed, half asleep, scrambling for the hearth poker. Will rose like a bear, but there were too many. 3, maybe 4. She didn't count. She only heard the crack of wood against bone, the thud of fists, the tearing of wool, the brutal sound of her name being used like a brand. "Clara Ashford," one barked, grabbing her by the arm. "Your father wants you home." She fought, kicked, bit down hard enough to draw blood. But it was no use. They bound her wrists with her own shawl and dragged her through the snow, her feet scraping trenches behind her. She saw Will fall to one knee, blood streaking his temple. One of the men kicked him hard in the ribs. He didn't rise again. The last thing she saw before they forced her into the sleigh was the cabin door swinging open behind them. Open like a wound, flapping in the storm. They took her south to a remote lodge just past Bear's Hollow, a hunting retreat Edwin used for private affairs. There she was stripped of her wool and put back into silk. Her hair was brushed. Her name was spoken again, over and over, like a curse. "Your father's worried sick," Edwin said when he arrived, all charm and white teeth. "You've caused quite the stir." She looked at him through swollen eyes, her voice cracked and low. "You sent men to beat him." Edwin didn't deny it, just poured a glass of brandy. "I sent men to retrieve what's mine." Clara turned her face away. In the quiet of that cold room, with its velvet curtains and iron locks, she realized there are cages softer than iron. Ones that smell like roses and speak in perfect grammar. Ones you're meant to thank for keeping you safe. But not this time. Not anymore. Benjamin Ashford had built railroads, spanned valleys with steel, and carved towns from the wilderness. He was a man feared and admired in equal measure, until the morning he found his daughter's bed empty and the wedding canceled without explanation. For days, he'd believed the rumors that Clara had gone mad, run off into the wild, been taken by fever or scandal or worse. But then, the letter arrived. Short, shaking, hidden in a shipment of feed delivered from a remote stop near Flat Hollow. Just 7 words scrawled in Clara's handwriting. "He sent men. Will is hurt. Help." Benjamin read it twice, then once more, and something inside the old tycoon and the man who'd built empires with calloused hands and a stone heart cracked open. He saddled a horse that same hour, rode north with 2 trusted men, and at the base of the timberline found the man his daughter had trusted in her worst hour, slumped and bruised beside a shattered doorframe. Will rose slowly as the elder Ashford approached. Blood crusted along his temple. One arm hung limp at his side. "You her father?" he asked simply. Benjamin nodded. "She didn't run from you," Will said. "She ran from him." The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was heavy. Old men carry pride like armor. Sometimes it takes a wound to let truth in. "She's at Mercer's Lodge?" Benjamin asked. Will nodded once. They rode hard through the night, up through Bitter Creek Pass where the snow ran red at sunset. They traveled without torches. No announcements, no letters. Just grit, fury, and the knowledge that Clara had never once asked for rescue, but had earned it all the same. At the lodge, Mercer's guards stood cocky and unaware. Until they weren't. It wasn't a gunfight, though weapons were drawn. It wasn't chaos, though furniture splintered and voices rose. It was a reckoning. Will moved like a man with nothing left to lose. Benjamin fought like a man trying to earn his daughter's forgiveness, not with words, but with broken knuckles and grit. Together, they cleared the lodge room by room. Clara was in the upstairs parlor, wrists still bruised, eyes hollow, shoulders straight. When the door burst open and she saw Will there, limping, bloodied, real, something inside her face lit like morning breaking over dark hills. She didn't cry. She stood, walked to him, took his hand, and for the first time in her life, Clara Ashford chose who would stand beside her, not by arrangement, not by name, but by heart. Edwin cornered, sneered. "You think the world will let this stand?" Clara turned to face him, voice calm as frost. "I don't care what the world lets. I care what I live with." And with that she left the house that had once caged her in silk, walked out into the snow beside the man who'd found her not as a bride, not as a name, but as a soul. Back in Flat Hollow, the snow began to melt, not fast, but steadily, like a long-held breath released. Icicles softened on the eaves. The creek behind the cabin, frozen solid just weeks before, murmured again beneath thin sheets of glassy ice. The land was waking, and so was Clara. She didn't speak much of what had happened. Not to Will, not to her father. Some things lose their shape when spoken aloud, but her actions spoke clearly. She stayed. She traded corsets for wool skirts, silk gloves for work-worn hands. Her father sent word daily at first, then weekly, and finally just a letter each month. Short, respectful, often enclosing checks she never cashed. One, however, she used, quietly, without announcement. The schoolhouse in Flat Hollow had been boarded up since the last teacher fled east. One morning, Clara rode into town with a bag of books, a carpenter's name, and enough money to reopen the doors. No speeches, no newspaper articles, just ink on paper and warmth by deed. A month later, a women's shelter opened in the next town over, underwritten by a benefactor who never gave her name. Only instructions, no questions asked, no one turned away. She did not want to be seen. She wanted to do. At the cabin, life moved with a slow, honest rhythm. Will's ribs healed. His eyes softened. He still didn't speak more than he had to, but sometimes that was enough. They shared quiet mornings, coffee that grew less bitter by the week, woodpiles stacked together in silence, long walks down to the water where Clara watched the fish stir and the sky change, learning the moods of the land the way she once studied her father's guests. In time, she came to know the names of birds, the feel of weather in her joints, the joy of hands roughened not by anxiety but by care. And Will, he never asked her to become someone else, never expected her to forget. He just stood beside her, in the kitchen, in the garden, under stars, like a man who'd once been lost and now recognized the signs of home in someone else's breath. Spring came early that year, soft, green, full of the kind of light that drips like honey through pine boughs. One morning, Clara stepped outside to find Will waiting beneath the tall tree near the cabin, the one where he'd first carried her in from the storm. He didn't kneel, just held out his hand. In it, a turquoise ring, smooth, worn, set in silver, small. "It was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me to keep until I was sure." Clara didn't weep. She smiled, took his hand, and said yes, not to the ring, not even to the man, but to a life. One made not of titles or wealth or control, but of firelight, bread shared between two, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be declared to be true. They married in late spring, under the tall pine tree that had once marked her rescue, and now marked her rebirth. No orchestra, no velvet aisle, just birdsong, wind through needles, and the hush of mountain air pressing close like a witness. Clara wore a linen dress the color of cream, her hair half loose, braided with wildflowers she picked that morning by the creek. Will wore his Sunday shirt, clean, pressed, and missing a button at the cuff. They stood without an officiant, without guests, without fanfare. Only her father stood at a quiet distance, his hat in hand, his eyes wet and proud. "I do," she said softly, voice steady, her gaze never leaving Will's. He smiled, small and sure. "Me too." They didn't kiss with flourish. They just leaned into each other, foreheads touching, and let the moment rest between them like a sacred thing. Afterward, they returned to the cabin, now hers as much as his, and lit the hearth together. That night they sat in companionable silence, hands intertwined, the ring cool on her finger, the air scented with pine and smoke. Clara looked around the room, at the fire, the books, the wooden floor she'd swept 100 times, and saw not simplicity, but richness, not lack, but abundance, a life she had chosen. Word of the wedding spread slowly, and then, not at all. Most people in town nodded when they saw them. A few smiled, a few whispered, but Clara didn't mind. She was no longer made of porcelain and pretense. She was forged of snow and fire, and silence survived. Over the summer, children returned to the schoolhouse. Women came to the shelter. Will planted new fruit trees near the ridge. Clara read aloud in the evenings, her voice stronger with each passing page. Some nights he would rest his head in her lap and listen, eyes closed, as she whispered lines of poetry and scripture, her hand carding gently through his hair. Autumn came gold and wide, with apples and thick quilts and the smell of cinnamon in the air. On her birthday, Will carved her name into the cabin door, beside his mother's and his wife's before, not erasing the past, but adding to it. Clara traced the letters with reverent fingers, her heart full. She had not been rescued, she had escaped. She had not been remade, she had returned to herself. And now, beneath the sky she had chosen, beside the man who never asked her to be anyone else, Clara Ashford Calder lived quietly, fully, freely, not as the daughter of a tycoon, not as the pawn of a marriage contract, but as a woman reborn by storm, steadied by stillness and loved, truly loved, one quiet day at a time.